All right, well, welcome everybody to our event tonight, navigating successful growth, building an engaged board of directors. I'm Jeff Moody, president of MDG, and we welcome you all here. We at MDG pride ourselves on putting out events like this, educational events that are helpful to everybody in our business community. Now, in addition to this event tonight, we also have, right here at HBSR, our gracious sponsors, another social event coming up on November the 19th. So please, all of you, put that on your calendars. So tonight we have a really extraordinary panel. We have Rich Wilmot, a partner at Glide Healthcare. We have Nancy Briefs, the co-founder and CEO at Altrix Bio. We have Steve Goulens, the co-founder of Think. Martha Shaden, a MedTech CEO and member of several boards. And we also have our moderator, Rick Williams, who has had many years of experience, including being a past president of the Harvard Business Association. Business School Association. Thank you for the correction. And he also has just published his new book, which is Creating the Future. So with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to our gracious host for the evening, HBSR representative, Alexander Adam.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everybody again. I'm Alex Adam. I'm a principal with Hamilton Brooksmith and Reynolds. We are a full-service intellectual property law firm and proud sponsor of MDG Boston. Our legal staff is immersed in the latest technologies, from chemistry to all engineering disciplines, including software and streaming. My background is in biomedical engineering, and I'm a patent attorney. Have been a member of MDG for a while. I'm really excited about tonight's topic, Engaged Board of Directors. I work with startups, it's very important. And of course, we have this tremendous panel. Excellent job, Rick, putting this together. I know you've done many events in the past for MDG. I think you've outdone yourself for this one. So we're all looking forward to tonight's panel. And Rick, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And thank you for hosting us. Okay, so the topic of tonight's panel, as you've gotten from the slide up here and the introductions, is your board of directors as a value accelerator for the company. So I hosted for MDG a program 6 or 9 months ago, I don't know exactly how long ago it was, on your core founding team and your core advisors as the essential quality that you have to go for founding a company. In other words, if you're founding a company, focus on getting the right founding team, focus on getting the right core advisors, your attorney, your accountant, whoever's going to help you with fundraising. That was the focus of that program. So this is a program following that one, which talks about companies that are a little bit bigger. You now have a real product. You're selling a product, you have real customers, you're now going to go into the growth stage. At that point, having an engaged board of directors is an extremely valuable value accelerator for the company. That's what today's program is about. Why is that true? We have a great panel to talk about their experiences with us and why that's true and how it works. So that's the topic of today's program. And I'm going to give you kind of a 5-minute introduction to what a board of director does. And then we're going to turn it over to the panel. We'll have some dialogue with the panel, and then we're going to open up to questions from you. And I know you've heard we all have all this expertise up here, but in truth, I think much of the value you'll get out of today's program is through the questions you ask. So as you listen to this, think about, I want to make sure I really understand how this works. Your questions are going to add enormous value to the program. So let's get started with this. So why have a board? My personal opinion is all companies that are really serious about being a company and a corporation should have a board. But I know it's a losing argument with very young companies. So we're focusing on the companies that now are at the stage where, as I said, where they have real paying customers. And the question is, how do they grow and be successful as a business? So the board, as I said, can be a value accelerator because of it's the resources it brings to the company, and also the experience and resources, the experience and networks that board members can bring. The board, in my opinion, you'll hear the board has the responsibility to hire and fire the CEO, but the board also acts as a coach and advisor to the CEO and the senior leadership of the team. The board, in a way, in an important way, is also a risk management committee. There's no title that says that it's doing that, but that is in fact what it's doing. It's from the experience that these board members have had. They have an understanding of what are the problems that you as a company are going to run into, you as a leadership team are going to run into. How should you think about the challenges and risks that you're facing? And also the board is one of the things that potential investors look at, that customers look at, that vendors who you may be asking to work with you as you develop your product and bring the product to market, they're going to look at your board and say, you know, is this really a value add board, or is it just a few of the founders that call themselves a board? So the board, if you have a great board, it brings credibility to the important constituents that you must have with you to succeed. So if you're chartered here in the state of Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts gives the responsibilities of the corporation to the board of directors. It says the board of directors is responsible for the governance of the company. It's responsible for, you know, making sure the financial filings are all done, all the reporting requirements are done, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sort of taking all that for granted and focusing on the value beyond that for the company. So as I said, the board has the responsibility for hiring and firing the CEO, but also think about the board as the one that's reviewing and in many, if not most cases, approving the major decisions that the leadership of the company is making. It doesn't mean that the board is responsible for, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. You do that, Mr. CEO. It's more that the leadership of the company, the CEO, is bringing to the board the major decisions that the company as a whole has to make. And so the board is an essential review of all the major decisions the company is going to be making. I mentioned that the board manages the risk for the reasons I mentioned. I'm not going to repeat that. And then finally approves the financial reporting that's going to the state and the public and the investors. The board is not running the company. The management is running the company. The board is into governance. The management and the CEO are responsible for managing the company and its operations. So, okay, what are the duties of a board member? If I'm sitting on a board, what am I supposed to be doing? Well, first of all, my loyalty, and loyalty is an important word in this, my loyalty as a board member is to the company. It's not to my personal interests. Even if I'm a major investor, my responsibilities as a board member are to act in the interests of the company as a whole and to act in the interests of all shareholders, not just myself as a shareholder. I'm responsible as a board member to act in good faith. I'm responsible for being speaking with candor and honestly and forthrightly with my fellow board members, with investors, and with the CEO. I have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. As I said, responsibility for all the shareholders and not my own personal interests. And in the end, board members are not perfect. They're not expected to make every decision, which in retrospect will be seen as exactly the right decision. But they are expected to put the time in, understand the issues, and act with reasonable judgment. Those are the duties of a board member. Okay. So the question is, how do you get the most from a board? If I'm a board CEO or an owner and I want to have a board, like my friend Jerry here is thinking about getting a board for his company, what does a good board look like? Well, first of all, you've got to get great people on the board. The people who have different perspectives, different experiences, and members who will commit the time as opposed to just showing up at a few meetings once a year. If you're the leader of the company and you want value out of the board, you've got to spend time educating the board as to what really is going on with the company. What are its issues? What are the challenges you're facing? How does it actually operate? What are the risks it's facing? So you as a leader, and I'm picking on Jerry because he's an old friend of mine, when you get your board together, you have to take, the group of us who are now your board, and you have to educate us as to really what's happening with the company. That is your obligation if you really want to get value out of the board. You also have to allow the board to make its own independent review of things like your financial records, your risk profile of the company, and what its business strategy is. Ask them. The board is not going to tell you what it should be, but when you say, okay, here's how I'm going to compete. That's my business strategies. How do I compete in the marketplace to be successful? You want to ask the board for their opinion about it and whether that's reasonable and get their inputs. The business model, how do we make a profit? Again, the board is not going to tell you what to do, but you certainly want to go to them with your concept of what your business model is going to be and whether that's reasonable in their comments. And finally, I'm just going to say that if either the CEO or the board has to be open, ask questions, be open to really listening, and take the time to really understand what each other is saying and what the different perspectives are. That's how you're going to get the value out of this. Okay, so what's the bottom line? Board of directors can be a value accelerator. The board governs, it does not manage. The CEO and the board must collaborate with each other and be open with each other, talk with candor and honesty. Coaching by the board of the leadership to help the leader be more successful, I think, is an important aspect and contribution to the board. And the board acts in the interest of all shareholders and not either their personal interests or the interests of themselves as a shareholder. And as just a bottom line, boards try to work with consensus, but consensus doesn't mean groupthink. Every board member, if they're doing their job, is there because they have a contribution to share, their own experiences, their own judgment, their own assessment of what's going on. So as an individual board member, you have to be prepared to put it forward in a constructive way, listen to understand other points of view, and contribute to the conversation with the general objective of achieving consensus. So that's the overview of how a board works. So what we're going to do now is move into the question and answer, but I'm going to have you guys spend a minute or so, a couple of minutes, 3 or 4 minutes, and move the chair actually over here so I'm close to you guys. Introduce yourselves, and then we'll have a introduce yourselves, and then we'll have a discussion among ourselves with some questions, and I'm going to give you to elicit some comments, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. So Rich, why don't you just go down? Rich, why don't you start yourself?
Sure. Rich Wilmot, just quick introduction on me. I've been in the venture space for about 20 years. Have sat on, I don't know the number of boards at this point, but a lot. I have sort of a unique venture background in that I started in academic venturing at Mass General Brigham. We had an inside out fund funding technology coming out of the research platform. I then ran a corporate venture fund at Phillips, and now I'm on the private side. So a lot of experience in different investment types of organizations. On the Gilda front, we are a transatlantic fund, so we have offices in Boston and Utrecht in the Netherlands. We are primarily health tech, mostly med tech in both Europe and the US. And then in Europe, we also have a biotech arm as well. The advantage and the differentiation is that we can look at opportunities that are coming from Europe going into the US, as well as support companies that want to expand beyond the US. We just raised our sixth fund. It's an $800 million fund. So we tend to be more growth stage, a little bit later stage on the investment sort of stage framework. Typically investing about 15 to 25 million in each company, and then reserving capital up to about 40 to 50 million.
Great, Martha?
Hi, I'm Martha Shaden. I am a serial entrepreneur. I would say the first half of my career, I worked for large multinational companies, interacting with the boards of those companies. Second half of my career, I was CEO of medtech startups. And now I'm semi-retired. I sit on 5 boards, 3 public, 2 private, chair one of the privates, and also very active with AVAMed, which you may know is the MedTech Industry Association.
Okay, Nancy.
Sorry, I have a bit of an allergy, but I'm Nancy Briefs. I am a serial entrepreneur. Like Martha, we've known each other for a lot of years. I'm on my 7th company. It is a small molecule drug that we believe will be used as a rebound for patients that come off the G drugs. So the indication is diabetes and obesity. It came out of the Brigham. We are preclinical, we expect to be in humans next year. And that's my day job. I sit on 3 boards. I chair 1 and previously have sat on 5 venture-backed boards as an independent board member.
That's great. Wow. It's nice to know these folks. A lot of great achievements here. I'm looking for an extra 50 if you have. I'm Steve Gullis. I live in Natick, where they have a little incubator now, where they have an incubator in every town, it seems, right now, which is wonderful because there's a lot of budding entrepreneurs that Martha and I was talking about, how many we're coaching in this world, which is wonderful. We have a great ecosystem here. I've had a very eclectic career as an academic scientist, which is where Rich and I knew each other. As an operator inside of a couple of companies, one I founded, I ran a venture capital fund for 10 years, which was a little boring for me, to be honest, because being on a board is great, but when you give advice, they don't follow. It's frustrating. You have less power than you think until they need more money. And then I ran a public company, and I got to ring the NASDAQ bell once, which I called my internship because I didn't know anything about banking, but it was a lot of fun. And then I retired for 3 years because my grandkids came back from California during COVID. And I got bored. I was on a lot of boards at that point, 12 or 13, because that's the time. And I started a new company called Think, THYNK. I acquired technology that's going to retrain every human's mind to get rid of the attention span problem we all have. We have lost 75% of our attention span in just 20 years. And kids are suffering the most. If you want to know why we're voting on MCAS to get rid of it, because tutoring has failed, because the problem is focus. It's not math and reading. But we'll get to that later.
So, okay, we have a terrific panel, and I just want to say this. I think about this discussion in 3 respects, actually. What is the value of the board to the company as a whole? What is the value of the board to the CEO and senior leadership? And then what's the value of the board to an investor? Why would an investor care one way or the other? So Martha, I'm gonna start with you. Talk a little bit about why you believe a fully engaged board is valuable to the company. Let's talk about that for a second. Why? I mean, so many boards, and we here in New England, I think this is something that we all have heard of and know of. Too frequently, the board is there just to have people's name on a piece of paper. It doesn't really function in any meaningful way. So why can a board be valuable to the company?
Yeah, I think the board role can be very different, and it can be nuanced, right? Depending on the type of company, the stage of the company, the composition of the management team. But I think about my experience on boards. I have a little board. Technology came out of Northeastern University, And this afternoon, I spent several hours with the management group talking about things that normally, and I'm the chair of that board, that normally you wouldn't be talking about, but it was, how do you put together a 6-month review, a performance review for the employees? Now, this sounds really basic, right? But when you're a new CEO and you're an academic and you don't have company experience, these kinds of things aren't intuitive, right? So I can add a lot of value by helping coach them on organizational dynamics and that sort of thing. You know, is the larger the company, the less, you know, I'm involved. I have one company where it's several $100 million, not so much involved in that at that kind of level. But they are trying to get into a new market with a very disruptive technology. Their portfolio is not very disruptive, so this is really new for them. And they're looking for help on how do you launch a disruptive technology. So they pulled me in to help them navigate that. So the value can be, depending on the scale and the needs of the company, can range from, you know, we want to make sure that you're compliant, to I need you to help me figure out this launch plan.
Nancy, comments on what, so why the board, how can a board be valuable to the company?
So first I'll start with the CEO side. I think as an entrepreneur, building a company takes as many brains and hands as you can get, because there's so much, it always takes longer. You're going to have detours, you might have to pivot. And I've found that that's where boards have been incredibly valuable, right? Having people that have had experience, both on the independent side, but also your investors. I mean, as you heard from both of them, if you're a VC, you see a lot of different businesses, right? And they can be very valuable to you because they can help you if things start not going the way you want, because their interests are aligned with yours, right? As a founder and as a management team. And that is to build value in your enterprise, right? And so you need to have a board member, and I always look for people that have a good mix for composition. Someone maybe that's had operating experience, right? So we've lived through these things. We've figured out how to navigate in and around them. But also I like to have, because our stuff is usually pretty scientific, I like to have someone that's deep in the science, either a co-founder who's an observer on the board, or someone that has a great domain knowledge that can help in that way. Now, on the other side, when I've been on the board as an independent board member, it's really been from my operational experience, right? To, as Martha said, to help the management team and the CEO, maybe to look around the corner before they think, to kind of take a view there of what's going on, either competitively or most of my boards have been cardiovascular implants, you know, percutaneous heart valves, stents, etc. And having done that before, I think can really help both from the clin reg side as well. So I typically get recruited to cardiovascular boards, but I have found I cannot imagine ever not wanting a board. And I know for some of you that are first-time CEOs, you're probably thinking, oh my God, what are you talking about? You know, I have to do all this work for the board. You're doing the work because you're trying to build your business, right? And get the most value from it. So lean into them to get their advice and help. Because there's an expression, Martha and I were talking about this, when I got my first board role about 15, 18 years ago, they said to me, nose in, fingers out. Oh, okay. So even though I was an operating CEO, they didn't want me operating at the company, right? It was just get in, know the business, but let us run it, right? So sometimes they might not give you advice if you don't ask, right? Too. So make sure you ask and say, I'm thinking about this. And I know that's hard the first time because you want to think that you've got it all under control and you know what you're doing. But the reality is we just need to have the right questions and we can all solve for the right answer if we work together. So.
But Steve, what's your experience view on why the company should have a board? What's the value of a board to a company?
As you heard from people's experience, I sort of see three stages of a company. One is what is just founded. And I think the board members there have a different persona, not a different role necessarily, but a different persona in terms of being a coach, asking about the business and really making their network available and offering feedback. And that's very rewarding. It's actually good, but you have to cut your losses. If someone's not listening, you have to be willing to walk away and give them the hard lesson that you're not doing what's in the right best interest of your company. The other hard question that you bump into is you have 6 founders there. You say, who knows how to do a molecular diagnostic assay? They all raise their hand. How many know how to do a financial model? Nobody does. You then realize, well, you got 5 too many founders here in the room, all right? Just sort of generally, how do you actually build that team? Because they don't have any expertise. Then you have the early venture companies that are not profitable or fledgling. And there it's I find that the most interesting and the most challenging. You say, if you have to pivot, when you pivot, and it's usually someone on the board who has to raise their hand and say, you know what, I don't think that's working. You told me at the last board meeting, we would know if it was working if you hit a revenue of 8 million, you hit 1. What do you say we think about why it's not working? Because everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid and the CEO is always right. So you have to step in with the right question and then you offer help with the answers. Often it's in your network. The most difficult answer that you need to provide is how to raise money. I've never been a first-time CEO who has a clue on how to raise money at all. And that's very, very critical. In the later stage companies, phase 3 drug companies, public companies that have 100 million in revenue, it is boring from my perspective. If you've ever been in a company that's running a phase 3 trial, I was in one that had 5,000 patients. Every board meeting, we're up to patient 462 now. It's blinded, so we have no idea what the answer is. Come back in 3 months. And so the role there is very simply to be in the public persona, be out there coaching them on the proper way to deal with the public dialogue, the bankers, and everything else, so that you're viewed. Because you're going to have a pivot, you're going to have a hiccup somewhere, but they have to be building a network they've never seen in their lives. And doing the black cars around New York City to all the banks is strange for most academic scientists. But if you don't do that, you're going to get tortured when your data comes back and you hit an endpoint, but not the other one. Because that's 90% of drug trials fail, as an example. So you can expect that. That's a different conversation we had yesterday.
Yeah.
Plan for crises.
So Rich, I'm going to put you on the spot to represent shareholders in general in this. So why should the owners care about the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an investor, half of the decision to make an investment is you're backing the entrepreneur, you're backing the team. And the reality is that there's no such thing as a perfect entrepreneur who can do everything exactly as they should.
Right.
You've got, as a CEO, you're making hundreds of decisions in running the business. And there are always going to be decisions you may make a decision that you make the wrong decision, has very little impact on anything, or something that you can certainly overcome. But there are bigger decisions in a business that if the CEO had to deal with, there are hundreds of smaller decisions and make these decisions on their own, you have the chance of drastically impacting the company, and sometimes it could be in a very bad way. And so having a board that you can help make these decisions with, that can collaborate with you and help you make decisions that are in the best interest of all the shareholders, because that's the fiduciary responsibility of all of us on the board, and do it in a manner where you're doing the right diligence, you're making sure that you're making, to the best of your judgment, the right decision. That is a huge help for a CEO. It takes a lot of burden off them and it allows them to run the business versus having to shelter themselves from that and do this all on their own. So I have a lot of comfort when I see a strong board with people that I trust and believe in and know how to be good board members, that they are there to add value, not to stop anything from happening or not to make decisions to block anything, but to do what's right for me as a shareholder and all the other shareholders.
So I'm just gonna pause for 1 second. I was listening to this. One thing we haven't talked about is a fiduciary board versus an advisory board. I don't know, just for a second, what's the difference? And what's the value you get from one versus the other? I don't know. I'll pick on you, Rich, to at least start the conversation.
Yeah, I think early on, when you need an advisory board, especially early, first-time CEOs or ones that are in a space that they don't necessarily know all that well. You want somebody guiding you, but they're there not necessarily to guide the entire business or look over the business. They're there to help you as an entrepreneur, help your team members, and help you make the right decisions early on. What a board is there to do is to help, not to direct you on what to do. They're going to bring different skill sets, but to make sure that you're all in agreement on what those decisions are as a fiduciary board or responsibility, where you have to be loyal to all the shareholders. You have to be diligent about what you're doing, and they're going to prevent you from making decisions that maybe don't reflect that. As an entrepreneur, you may make a decision that you can't really separate the personal decision versus what's best for all the shareholders. And I think you certainly have experience, and you certainly have, the fiduciary board can fill a lot of gaps in terms of your knowledge and skill set. But at the end of the day, they're there to make sure that the right decisions are made, whereas advisors are there to help you learn and grow in your business. And that's the way I kind of look at it. I think it's very important to have both, and they're going to bring different aspects to the table.
Nancy, any thoughts on advisory versus fiduciary? I think a lot of people who haven't really thought about this are not clear what the difference between them is. I think Rich has given us a good introduction. Any comments you want to add to
No,
it?
I just would echo what Rich has said. I think especially for first-time CEOs, or even maybe your second time, or if you're in a new market or something, it's really important because you're looking for very specialized support, right? Which is where I think of advisory boards, as you said, where in the corporate board, it's more the strategy, the business, our duty to build the most value that we can. So I think most of the startups I've been involved with have both. Right?
Yeah, same here. I agree with Nancy and Rich. You know, I've seen where very young companies have technical boards, and usually they're made up of KOLs who help the company, and I'm talking medtech, navigate through clinical trials, providing guidance and expertise on developing the protocol for the trial, et cetera, et cetera. In one case, we had a clinical advisory board. We also had a commercial advisory board, and that was made up of KOL surgeons, but we used them to help us in the messaging in the field, figuring out our go-to-market strategy, and helping refine that a bit. And those two boards were separate from the corporate board. The corporate board, I think, these advisory boards, you want a charter for them, right? You should write a charter. You should develop very clear expectations and governance, but it's different than the corporate board, which is much more formal, you know, and it's more overarching on making sure that the company is accountable to the shareholders.
Just a quick, I do like having advisory boards to solve specific problems. So when you get into a field, you can't have a board that's an expert in every domain. Pick all the human diseases, and you have a drug that could be in many of them. Suddenly you figure out, oh, we're going after, type 15 diabetes, who knows what it is. You go find the people, that is their specific job. They don't have to know anything about finance, funding and everything else. And you get enormous value out of those people because they feel so rewarded to be in a position of strategy in a big, important company. And those are really valuable conversations. Boards they're long lasting. They go on these short-term advisory. As you said, we need a plan to launch through the FDA right here. So you're done with superstars who are happy to contribute.
Okay, so let's just raise a hand. Who is leading a company and has a board right now? Just raise your hands. Okay. Who is sitting on a board, a private or public board? Okay. Okay, so the question I want to pose to the panel is, my dear friend Jerry is thinking about putting a board together. So how should he think about who would be on the board? Jerry, I'm not picking on Jerry specifically, but just since we had a conversation before coming in here, I know he's thinking about doing that. What advice would you give to Jerry about who he should have on his board? Why not?
I'll start, I guess. So I'd want to know, there's a few things I'd want to know, Jerry. What stage of the company are you? Is it a med tech company or?
It's a medical device company with 750 million potential customers,
Okay, early stage,
seed stage.
C stage, okay. So I think that it's really important that in the early stage, first of all, a board is not necessarily a stagnant kind of entity, right? It should evolve as the company grows, and you're going to need different expertise on your board at the very early stages versus when you're ready to, you're close to regulatory approval, and then in the commercial stage. I was brought on a couple of boards because they were ready for commercialization. And I happen to have deep experience on the commercialization side of med tech. So it was natural that they would bring me in. I'm on a cardiology board. I don't know cardiology. My background is sports surgery and orthopedics, but the skills or the expertise translates from, business to business. It's more about the functional experience. So I would look at where are your gaps in your organization. If you're in, you're looking to fundraise, which as a CEO, we're always looking to fundraise. I might want somebody on my board who has a lot of fundraising experience, like Nancy. So you might want to talk to Nancy after.
I'm full.
She's full. But I'm joking, right? But you might want somebody with that expertise. Nancy said, in the early stages, you might want somebody with technical experience that understands the therapeutic space. And so, that's in the early stage. And then you might want somebody who just has general operating experience, who can be, as Nancy and Rich and others have mentioned, just a spiritual and support system for you. Just to, like today, I was sitting with the CEO who just needed to know, how do you fire a person? Okay, and that's not really in the definition of a board, right? But they're a very early nascent business, and I'm happy to be able to help them with that. As you get closer to regulatory and commercial, you're going to want to bring somebody on who has that kind of chops. And if you only have investors on your board, I would highly recommend you bring in an independent director, because Rich is only looking out for himself. No, it's not true, but there is a bit of a conflict there, right? So you want somebody who's independent, that can sort of balance Rich's interests and involvement. So you want to make sure that you think about that as your the number of board members. There's no magic number. You don't want 20. That's just ridiculous, right? It's like herding cats. I'd keep it small in the early stages. I don't know. What do you think? 3, 4, maybe 5?
I have this rule of thumb: 3 when you're doing C. I like odd numbers, right?
Yeah.
Five, when you
Right.
get that first A or you've got proof of concept, then 7. I've never gotten past 7.
No, I haven't been on a
I was
board
just
past 7. I think
Yeah.
it gets unwieldy. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the stage, but typically I'd like to see a board where I'm coming in with institutional capital where it is a 5-person board, and the reason being is you're typically gonna have 1 to 2 investors on there. You want to have independence on that board as well, because you're gonna have founder, CEO positions potentially out of those 5. You're gonna have the couple of investors, but who's gonna bring that different profile that's going to benefit you as a company and benefit you as a board the most? And when I'm doing early stage investing, where we are in that position of let's restructure the board, and we put together a 5-person board and we're gonna do an independent as part of that, as soon as we close the deal, that's the first thing I wanna do is start setting the profile. And it's designed to be set with the CEO. It's not meant to be something that says, hey, the CEO is not capable of this. It's done in collaboration to find the right person that's going to benefit you as the CEO, your leadership team, and the company the most. And I think it's a critical part. I completely agree with Martha on the part that
That
you
you're
don't want
looking up
only
yourself?
you only want investor board members. But I will say, like, one of the things that I'm very adamant about, and I've been in some dicey board situations, and it's put me in this mode. I really separate my role as an investor from my role as a board member. And there's the way that we structure any investment, it puts us in a position where we can do that. So as a board member, I am 100% honoring my fiduciary responsibilities to do what's best for the company. I want my CEO on a board to be as successful as possible. I want to support them. But at the end of the day, if I'm an investor and I've got investors in my fund, I have to do what's right for them. So I may, on the board level, say, I completely agree, this is the decision we should make. But as part of the investment that I've made, I have protective provisions as an investor, where if it doesn't make sense for me as an investor, I have the ability to, okay, from the investment standpoint with my other hat on, that doesn't work. I'm never going to do that in my position on the board, but I have that ability to do it as an investor. It's an important part of every investment. You're going to see it, the protective provisions. There may be a couple of scenarios where you need where you need a separate vote that gives the investor the ability to push something forward. It's generally on the board, you're going to be consensus. It's very rare that you end up with a situation where you're actually 3-2 on the board. Typically, it's everybody is voting in favor unless somebody has to recuse themselves. As an investor, I know there's a mechanism to do what I need to protect my investment. I'm never going to do that as part of the board. And you have to make sure that you're dealing with investors that take that same mindset. Otherwise, you will have conflict at the board level.
So he's saying something very important, Terry, and that is that, first of all, he's a very seasoned, serious board member, right? He's a professional. He knows his role as a board member. Something we haven't talked about, and it's very nuanced, is the composition of the board from a personality standpoint. And you got to be really careful with that. And that's harder to figure out, and figure out what kind of people do you want on your board. You don't have to like them, but they've got to be serious and, professional and understand their role as a board member.
So I have a very pragmatic approach to it. Start up to do 3, because you're going to kick somebody off when you bring in money. If you don't, all right. If you bring in 5, 2 are going to resent you for having kicked them off a year later. It's all about money, money, money your first 2 years. Go to the source of money, like this guy, or like anybody who runs a venture fund that you want to invest in you 3 years from now. Ask them who they respect the most as an independent board member. It's very pragmatic. You'll have an immediate connection to that firm and every other firm in the city. And you'll meet some new people who are wonderful.
Great. Steve, I want to come back to you in 1 second with this question about who should be on the board depending on what phase the company is in its development. Rich, I want to come back to you for a second, because you mentioned the idea, I just want to make sure that we really understand what you were referring to. If you're coming in as a significant investor and you say, okay, if I'm putting my money into this, I want these special protections, or I want to be able to approve before you do this, that, or the other. Talk about how that's done, as opposed to, I'll get on the board and then I want to get my way with, what I want for myself as an investor. Talk about how that's actually done.
Yeah, so in the process of completing an investment and going through the legal documentation of putting that investment together, which includes investor rights, which includes voting agreements, it includes anything from co-sale, if somebody's trying to sell their shares, who has the right to buy those, who has the right to co-sell with those individuals. That's stuff that all gets documented as part of the investment. And in the investor rights agreement, as part of that, you have what are called protective provisions for investors. And what that does is it gives you an opportunity as an investor to say, okay, well, if the company decides they want to raise a certain amount of debt, we put a threshold in there, anything above $100,000, what happens to me as an investor is it may be the right thing for the company to do that, but that puts my money now behind this debt investment. I should have a say as an investor in, should they be able to go and raise that money? Now, the board may say it's the right thing to do, but as an investor, I do have that extra protection where I can come back and say, I'm not quite comfortable with that. Maybe there's a better mechanism to do this. So that's a typical protective provision. It may be, the company decides they want to make a pivot. And they started out as a medical device company and they want to move into more of a digital play. I would probably like that because I do a lot of digital health investing. But let's say that didn't meet the charter of my fund and what my investors are expecting. It may be the right thing for the company to do, but I, as an investor, maybe I want to protect against that and say, no, we still want to be going down this path. I, as a board member, am going to do what's right for everyone as a shareholder. But I do, or my fund does, have the opportunity to push back on that. So you have these protective provisions, you generally set them up, you don't want a single investor controlling them. And that's why you want to have syndicated rounds of investment, because you want to make sure there's at least two investors who are aligned. Because they're generally trying to make money off of this investment, which means they're aligned in terms of creating shareholder value, but they may have very specific reasons why something might not work. If you have a single investor with blocking rights on stuff, that can be dangerous. But if you have multiple investors, it means they have to at least be aligned to do that, which means they're most likely going to be well aligned with all shareholders. Okay, so I'm going to go. I'm going to owe Jerry something after this for picking on him here. But let's say that Jerry has a potential investor who says, I'm going to put some money in, but I want to be on the board to make sure I get what I want out of this for my investment. What would you say to that? I'd say that's probably not the right investor. You want an investor like in earlier stage deals, it's not as competitive, but at some point in time, as an investor, you're going to get into a situation where there's a company that multiple investors want to go into. You have to be able to bring value to the company. It's not just the dollars you're putting in.
Right.
You need to be bringing additional value. And if your approach is, and this is why you have to be careful with certain investors, if their approach is, I'm coming in to protect my best interests, that's a terrible board member. And they're going to disrupt and create a dysfunctional board where they're going to get people pitted against each other. And you're going to end up with a really difficult situation where you're probably not extracting any value.
What about that person saying, I'm not going to have you on the board, but you can be a board observer? Again,
They can still be just as disruptive as a board observer, even more so because they don't have a fiduciary responsibility. And certainly there's been many observers where you've run into situations where they have been disruptive And in that case, unless it's written in the documents that they have a right to that observer seat, you're probably gonna get them, if you wanna fix the issue, you're probably gonna remove them from board meetings.
Okay.
But it is, if you have an investor that is going to be a negative influence on the board, you just don't want them as an investor, because they're gonna wanna have some say, they're gonna wanna have rights to be a part of these discussions.
Mhm.
And you have to be really careful. Reputation is everything. So if an investor goes and does that, and they've probably done it before, and do your diligence on those investors. Because if they've been on other boards and they've been highly disruptive, it probably hasn't been a good outcome.
Yes.
I just want to add to what Rich has said. You know, when you're taking money, they're doing diligence on you and your team. You need to do the same with them. So you might say, well, how do you do that? Just go look at their portfolio on who they've invested in and call the CEOs and say, we're thinking of taking money. What has your experience been with the fund? And, you know, as CEOs, I don't think we do that enough, right? And that's an easy way to figure out, are they going to be, you know, collaborative, or are they going to be disruptive? Because we've all been on boards that have had that one person who disrupts it, and it's awful, you know? It takes too
And what
much time.
happens is you find out that not everybody's like Rich. in this
Right,
industry.
Yeah. So, Steve, talk about, we're gonna turn it over to the, to you, who I know are gonna ask really great questions. Talk a little bit about the difference of, I asked the question, you know, who should be on the board?
Mhm.
I mean, there's also the question of who shouldn't be on. We've heard one example, but talk about the difference between the boards that are who should be on the board for the different stage companies. You talked about this a little bit, but sort of take it through the stages of.
Mhm. Well, in the early going.
Really, who should be on the board?
In the
at
early going,
different
it's about
stages?
strategy, coaching, fundamentally, and fundraising, which is part of what your strategy needs to be. And so you need people who have big networks to start with. That undoubtedly, it's nice to have someone who's in your field, but I'm talking about in your field generally. They don't need to be an expert in this kind of device or this kind of electronics. They need to be in med tech, like you heard from Martha, because then they understand how the game is played. And they can anticipate what's going to happen in a year. Because that's the thing CEOs are the worst at, is what's it going to be like a year from now? Because they've never been in that position where we're running out of capital. I have to go back to the same investor. How do I tee that up? How often do I communicate? So these are all the coaching. It's just the general blocking and tackling. And if you have people who are generalists with broad, diverse networks is the key. People, I'm really trying to build a big network on the West Coast right now because mine's not very strong. So all of my time is spent focusing out there because I know that there's a lot of interesting opportunities that come from that side of the world, rather than just saying, oh no, this is the crowd that's going to be really good and we'll go from here. As you get to the middle stage, now you need people who understand corporate governance, because it was really critical. I can't tell you how many times lawsuits are threatened, employee suits. It always comes up, and I've been in companies on boards where a frivolous lawsuit comes in as a patent infringement lawsuit, and the company can't raise a penny. Actually, I was on a call yesterday where Lenovo was threatening something against us. We're this big, and I just shut the lawyers up and said, "Do this. This will solve it." Because these were young lawyers who didn't know what the hell they were doing. They were giving me the 15 choices of what to do. But I just happened to be the CEO. But if I was sitting with someone, I would just say, do that, and you're done. So in one phone call with Lenovo, it was over. And that was it, because I had the experience of how you deal with these things. That's the kind of people who, there's an operating role or somebody who's been on board with all of the pivot problems you bump into. Once you get to the later stage, it's all about raising money. Having a public company. Public is the M&A, the banker universe. Have you written S1s? Have you done any of that? Can you coach people to do roadshows? And so there are different skills, and there you actually need those people to give you help as a team. Who actually should be on the roadshow? There's always a lot of jockeying. The CFO should be, well, the CFO doesn't tell the story as well as the CBO. Let's go with that person. And so there's a lot of things that go on, and the board can actually help the CEO. So the CEO is not taking all the pressure, because as you get later and later stage, there's higher pressure on the CEO to be alone. Management's, everybody in the company is worried that they're doing the wrong thing. They can't ask for advice. They can't ask good advice on how do you actually run a process with bankers, because they're a little bit embarrassed. And so at that time, you actually need people who can be comfortable with somebody who's senior, who's accomplished, and everything else. And it's so what I'm saying is you have to change boards fundamentally, and often you change CEOs, which is a different story.
I'm gonna ask, I said we were gonna go to questions here. Well, let me just ask one other question. I'm gonna pose it to you, but really to everybody. So if you look, okay, you don't have gray hair, at least as you're sitting here, but nonetheless, all of us sitting up here have gray hair. Often the people, the wonderful people that we're working with, who are the early stage founders and leaders of the company, don't have gray hair. I'm using that as an analogy to say there's an awful lot of, one of the values of the board is an awful lot of experience that the board can bring from just having gone through this, all the stories that Steve's talking about. Okay, well, now you're talking with somebody who might be 30 years old, no gray hair, who hasn't gone through all these experiences. As this is very much, Steve, as you're talking about a personal relationship, you have to have trust. How do you, as a board, have conversations like that with somebody who hasn't had your experience, who, you know, they've gotten where they are because they really believe in what they're doing. And if they weren't nuts and believe what they were doing, in spite of all the evidence contrary to it, or their ignorance of what really might happen, they wouldn't be doing it. Okay, so now you're sitting on a board with these wonderful, really wonderful people. How do you manage, how do you as a board member and as a board as a whole manage that relationship? Steve, why don't you start, and then I just think it'll be interesting to hear us talk about that.
This is just flashbulbs going off in our brain, because inevitably if something arises when the CEO is struggling, it does, maybe it's business related, maybe it's personnel or something else, at which point you have this dynamic where, and I'm not the person who have this slide, but most boards do not fire someone at the right time. They wait far too long. But at the same time, the person they hire may be walking into a situation, something fixable. So you've actually made two mistakes. You've put more money into the new CEO. So you need someone who has a personal, can set up a personal relationship. It gets away from the board itself to an individual who can communicate with the board, with the CEO, or with somebody in the, and often I've even had mutinies where I get a call from 8 members of the team saying the CEO's got to go. I don't know, maybe you've been in some of these calls too. You go, oh my God, I thought things were perfect. Everybody's quitting tomorrow. You need to have someone who can communicate, and it can be 2 people. Actually, it's often 2 people in this first encounter. We have a problem here. It's fixable because you're smart, you've taken the company this far. So the business has a problem here. We need to think about the strategy you're doing. So it's a one-on-one conversation, but the whole board is informed about it. But you pick 1 or 2 point people to go about it. If it's the individual who's the problem, I can talk about coaching. You can't pick the coach for them, but you can suggest that works about 1/3 of the time in general. But the coaches can be good. If someone listens, they can actually. One time someone said to me, I had no idea. I thought he'd had a lobotomy after the coach had worked on it for about 8 weeks. He said, what happened is personality. I said, he listens. He listens to somebody who's rational and who's been around the block a few times, who wasn't on the board. So there was no conflict there. But the other 2/3 of the time, you're going to bump into problems. So it really starts among board members building this personal relationship. Usually, try to do it early. Some CEOs are just resistant to it. I run into one who was just, he wouldn't even tell me the names of his kids, so I was just trying to be friendly. But you see these personality types. But at the end of the day, it's interpersonal issues that are the #1 driver of problems. And so it begins there, finding a board member who can communicate with the CEO.
Yeah.
And I would add that that's where the independent board member can be incredibly helpful. Because I've had that role in 5 companies because I was the independent. And so the CEO, you know, I built a relationship and they could have those discussions. So that's why you want to have an independent board member too, right? Who can help you. who does have some gray hair, right? Even though they're young. And I think it's a matter of the trust, just building that trust as we heard from Steve.
Yeah, I would also, just to add, I think that Stephen and Nancy said it really well, but just to add that if you've got a CEO who's resistant to exploring other notions or views, or even just listening, you're probably not going to be a CEO for very long. They're going to self-destruct very quickly. A VC friend of mine who was looking to invest in a company, actually happened to be a Canadian company, asked me to get on a couple of calls with him and this CEO, because he was potentially going to invest and wanted to get a sense of the CEO. And so we spent 1 hour, two meetings, 1 hour each, talking to the CEO. And at the end of it, the VC didn't invest. It wasn't because of the technology. The technology was really compelling. It was the CEO. And unless, and you've had this case where your money is only going to go in if you can change out the CEO, right? But if you can't, it's an untenable situation. And I wouldn't invest if that wasn't an option on the table. But if it doesn't, I don't think the age is the issue, it's the personality and their EQ, and whether they're willing to entertain alternative views or approaches. And I find, generally speaking, especially the millennials, that they will, and they're eager for the coaching, actually. I find that more often than I find the situation that we had in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a fine line when you're trying to get to know a CEO. You want somebody who has conviction, who wants to make decisions, but you also don't want to be in a situation where you've got somebody very stubborn who just won't listen and will continue to go down a path. And so I think one of the things I try to do is establish the relationship right off the bat. If I have an earlier or a younger CEO who hasn't had a lot of experience, sometimes that's a really good thing, because they're willing to try things that a more seasoned person, just being in the healthcare space, has seen too many instances where something doesn't work and it doesn't go the right way. And that's why sometimes I don't mind having a CEO come from the outside, as long as they're willing to listen. Because ultimately the way that you can bridge that gap between, you've got somebody with their own views and approaches, and then you've got somebody with a ton of experience. And I may not be a CEO by background. I don't have the same skill sets that Nancy and Martha have, and Steve. But what I do have is just experience with so many companies, seeing things happen and go the wrong way, seeing things happen and go the right way. That's what my job is, to get that across to a CEO, to someone who doesn't necessarily have that experience. But sometimes I do like someone who comes in and their ideas go against what I've seen in the past. They need to convince me that that's the right path in that situation. And I do think the other piece is, there's always a natural conflict between a CEO and certain board members, because you know that ultimately the board is responsible for hiring and firing the CEO. In almost every startup, if you come in early stage, you're going to hit a point where that CEO may not be the right person to lead the company moving forward, especially in device, where you go through development stage.
Think about that, Jerry. Think about that.
I think you need to establish that up front. You're there to make that CEO successful. You want to make it clear to them that that's your job, but there may come a time that you need to transition. You're not looking to do that. You're looking to make that person as successful as possible. But the reality is, your job as a board member is to make sure you have the best opportunity for that company to be successful, and sometimes it's someone else.
Okay, let's open it up to some questions. Questions? We got a question right there.
Sure. So we've talked a lot about what a company might look for in other board members, but as people who have been on multiple boards and been very successful, looking at from your perspective, as I'm looking at this company and they have an opening on the board, and are there things that really motivate you and say, yes, I want to be involved with this organization yesterday, And conversely, are there really significant red flags that say, I'm not gonna touch that organization with a 10-foot pole?
Yeah. And so I'll jump in, and I think that I probably share many of the same feelings. I don't want to be on a board with a bunch of jerks. And it's a close community. I mean, we all know each other or know people who know each other. So it's pretty easy to network and figure out who's a jerk and who isn't. And it's just not worth my time personally. First and foremost, I have to believe in the technology and that it has legs. Second, I have to believe in that management group and believe that they can take it to, the next milestone, whatever that is. And we talked about CEOs that just, are, they don't have the right EQ. I mean, I don't want to work with somebody like that. It's, it's an exercise in frustration. But I do look at the board and it's pretty easy to figure out whether a board is functional or it's dysfunctional. And don't believe that you're going to be able to affect that dysfunctionality, because you're not. It's not going to change, because it's usually one or two bad actors that are on the board, and you're not going to change them. They have a reputation. So that's what I look for. Those are my sort of screening 1, 2, 3.
One other comment is you should sort of self-evaluate. Why are they asking me? If you have a background as a bankruptcy attorney, it might be a clue of why they're asking you. And I'm being serious because I've had an approach, in the early days, I'd say yes, then suddenly decide to learn that I'm the one who's raising all the money for you. How did I get in this position? And that's why you picked me. Now that I want to know what specific reason. You don't have to be open conversation completely. You just have to be self-critical, say, how am I going to help here? And if it's only for an expertise that says this company's struggling, I need to reconsider.
Yeah, I just want to add something to what Steve said, because that's really important. I was called by a PE firm who on a board, and through the conversation, we had many conversations, and through the conversations, I find out that their plan is to get rid of the CEO in 6 months.
Right.
And that they're bringing a new board member in as a potential replacement for the CEO. Well, that's just not aligned with my personal goals. So, I said, I'm not the right person for you, but you got to ask questions like that.
Yeah, you need to ask them, why do you think I would be a fit? And then, as you heard, you need to do your diligence on the other board members, but also you need to meet all of them and do it individually, right? So you can get a sense if there's any potential disruption going on.
I'll bring up one situation. I had a terrible experience when I was at Phillips, actually, where I didn't necessarily have a yes or no vote in some of the investments we made. I was there to help facilitate and then manage the opportunities. So we had one of our businesses who wanted to invest in a later stage business. It was about $70–80 million top line, a little bit more of a service heavy business. So it hadn't taken on a lot of capital to that point. And in the diligence, it was clear they had a 2-person board. It was the 2 co-founders, and they had cut corners. They were running fast and loose, and we knew this going in. We set up the structure on the board. So we said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to bring 2 independents in, but to start, we're going to have 2 people from Phillips on the board so that we have a balanced board. And then first thing we will do is bring in the independents, and then Phillips would relinquish one of their seats. We got in there. Within 1 month, we had a whistleblower, the CFO, who got fired, came back and basically informed us that he believed the CEO and the other co-founder were taking money out of the company. It was a disaster. And that is something where if I ever see a situation where you've never had a board other than the founders, and yes, it's great from a control perspective and you can do what you need to do. If you've scaled that business and you've never brought on somebody with some level of balance there, I'm not I'm gonna be very fearful of what can happen, and that's because of the experience I went through. So I do think it's important, even if you don't necessarily need to build a board because you're growing the business, having somebody who's independent from the co-founders early on is going to help you when you're building your board further down the road, because they at least know somebody's been in there from a governance perspective, overseeing the founders who are running the business.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add, sort of experience I had as an independent director. Because in a way, it a little bit goes back to what Steve's comment about, well, why do they want you on the board? And this was a situation where the founder was the CEO, did not like being in that job, and said, I need to get out of this job, we need to find somebody else, but really wasn't ready, willing to kind of take the step and bring somebody else in. And so it was a company that was controlled by a VC firm. And I ended up becoming the board chair. I first was on the board, then became the board chair, because nobody else was, in a way, kind of trusted by everybody. I was the only one everybody sort of trusted, as somebody who didn't have a personal interest in kind of the issues that have been going on with the company for years. And I was the only one who, you know, was in a position to help both the founder, the VC firm, and the other board members kind of go through the process of finding and bringing a new CEO to lead the company. So it's both a question of, you know, what is your role in the board? And also, what are the other people on the board doing? I mean, are they really committed to doing the work that they have to do, or whatever? So understand both what your role would be, and also kind of what's the role of the other people on the board. I mean, I would just add that as a dimension to think about. Anyway, another question?
Yeah, hi, Joe Remedy, partner at Gennari Aronson. Actually proud to say I've recently joined the board of MDG, working with Jeff and Judy and the rest of the board. Welcome. So we're a corporate law boutique. We work with dozens and dozens of early stage companies. Like probably all of you have seen boards function in a lot of different ways, you know, a set of yes men kind of just rubber stamping whatever maybe founders put in front of them. I've seen, you know, the investor directors kind of just essentially, you know, become taskmasters and just kind of set things in stone, and there's not much. And then you see, like, you know, the boards that really work well with collaboration, give and take, and a sounding board. I think, Martha, one of the things you said earlier kind of resonated about, you know, skills translating. And I had a question, kind of more of an open-ended question about your thoughts and experiences on when you're looking for those independent directors, you know, how much to kind of target specificity versus general, you know, skills. I'm thinking of two particular clients of mine. One was a board on a tech company where their biggest vertical, where they wanted to make more headroads, was aviation and military. They actually had 3 independent director spots. And a few years back, they loaded up on ex-military and aviation executive folks, you know, former generals and things like that. And those folks did make some headroads with their networks and introductions to specific, you know, people in the military, aviation, that helped kind of fuel some sales. But, you know, for lack of a better describing it, kind of dried up a little bit. And their role on the board really was pretty limited after those kind of introductions. Whereas, you know, I'm also, you know, a client of ours is in ed tech. That's ed tech, not med tech. And they have a couple of directors who were brought in who didn't really have that much specific involvement in that exact area, but their board functions so well in terms of there's just thoughtfulness, consideration of how they should alter strategically marketing and sales and pricing on product and all these types of things, where, you know, the guy he's just a smart guy who has had various success in various businesses, but it wasn't like this other very specified, we have to get a former general who could connect us to people in the military, to get a former, Boeing exec who can connect us to people in aviation. And where there was some good aspects of that, it kind of ran its course. So an open-ended question to the panel of what you think about really specifically targeting specific reasons to bring on someone for a specific role as an independent director versus just someone who can give you sound advice and kind of help you strategically maneuver.
Yeah, I'll start. I think that they may have been thinking more advisory board, right?
Yeah.
Than board, corporate board. And it feels to me, based on what you said, which, I have limited knowledge of the business, et cetera, but, those people probably would have been better suited for an advisory board because it's a very specific thing and it's probably time bound. And once you get through that problem, their usefulness on the board diminishes tremendously. Putting a board together is like pieces of a puzzle, right? And, I'm on one board where the company doesn't have a lot of experience on DTC, direct to consumer. The product lends itself to direct to consumer. There is a question by the CEO, do we bring somebody in on the board with that experience? My feeling was no. I think that's, you hire a consultant who can help you with that kind of, problem and help you solve that. But to bring somebody on just because of that, I don't think is, we have recently reconstituted the board and bringing on more operational people because we're in this sort of high growth. And each of us have different aspects of commercial experience that together we're very powerful. But I'm also a strong advocate of diversity on a board. There is loads of research that says that the more diverse a board, the better the performance of the company. And I think that's hard to argue. And I don't mean ethnicity or, gender. I'm talking about diversity of thought, right? And how do you get that? And I think it can be very powerful if you do it right. But it feels to me like they may not have really been thinking, they were thinking more advisory, and that probably was something that they may not have wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, you see, we need someone with a finance background, and that's more of general applicability.
It is.
We need someone who could get us into Boeing, and that's great when it happens, and then they send your board for 2 more years without really contributing.
Yeah, right, yeah. I mean, that's a really good example of the nuances around how do you, what's the composition of your board? There's so many gray areas around this thing, right? And it's not an easy thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I've had dysfunctional boards and I've had very functional boards, and I'll tell you, dysfunctional board can do as much harm to the company as a functional board can add value. So you got to be really careful.
I think to add to that is it's like when you're hiring in a startup. Very rare your first 20 hires are you going to hire somebody fit for a very specific role.
Right.
You're kind of hiring the best athlete, right? Somebody who can come in and do a lot of things. Maybe they don't have great expertise in a single area, but you understand their personality and they can go dive deep on one end, they can spread themselves out in other areas. And I think you have to think as you're selecting board members, a little bit more of that mentality. Yes, you may want a specific skill set. You don't necessarily need to have somebody who has pure expertise in that area, but maybe they have some experience and they can add value. And we went through this with a board recently where we brought in independence. We were pivoting the business to move toward more of a value-based care approach. It was a digital health company. And we wanted to bring in somebody who had some expertise in the value-based care space. But we didn't want to bring in somebody who was not going to function on the board. We ended up bringing in somebody who had never had an independent board position before, but they were the CEO of a value-based care business. They were very eager to learn and gain experience on the board. which meant that they weren't going to be stubborn and create issues, and they grew into a fantastic board member. And I would bring them on any board moving forward because they had the CEO experience, they had some value-based care experience, they had a willingness to learn and adjust and be strong board members, and they contributed a ton. And I think that you always want to be careful about being too specific about one thing.
Jeff, I'm gonna say last question. We're 7:30. Okay, last question.
Okay, so since all of you have been on miserable boards, I'm gonna ask you the opposite thing. You get this really pain in the ass board member that no one likes, or who's shirking their financial fiducial responsibility. How do you get rid of them? And
Oh, that.
I mean, if they're the majority shareholder, it's almost impossible to do that. Almost impossible. I'd say run. Run away.
It's very, very hard.
It's really.
Why don't you speak from the perspective of the role, having a right to the board seat, and I'll talk about the independence.
Yeah, I mean, it depends who that board member is. If that's the lead investor, that is gonna be problematic. It's gonna be hard. But if it's not the lead investor and you can go in and when you can put in your financing terms, I'll put this capital in, but we need to change the board, that's probably the cleanest way to do it.
My experience is you can never get a lead investor board member off because they will be so embarrassed at their own firm
Yeah,
that they can't even go to work anymore. No matter what the rationale is. And I'm talking about some of the best firms in the city have people like that in them who just behave in ways that are not sensible. Or you have an independent board member, you have to work around it. And I've actually been in this situation where someone, at the end of the story, he's looking in the windows to see about why are all the board members having lunch together? And within the rules, if you have someone who's an observer, you can say, all right, then we're having an executive meeting. And then you have a 2-hour executive meeting instead of a 15-minute executive meeting. And all of the important stuff goes on there. So you end up having 2 board meetings at the end of the day that you can structure legally to do. And it's very disruptive. That's why this guy was peering in the windows. Because you're allowed to do that. You just say, we have a special committee for working on the M&A.
okay, so I'm sorry, so you can't just vote them off the ship.
Is this person a lead investor?
No, let's assume he's just a commoner. Just a regular
You can
board
vote them off. Yes, you can.
You can put it.
You can't because they're on for terms.
Right.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
got everybody, the board member is hired for a 1-year, 2-year, or 3-year term.
So you wait it out.
Well,
You buy them out, you buy them out.
right.
I've never done it without a
If
check
they're not
going
an
out the door.
investor.
You
what
always,
do you do?
you always send money on.
So I, having been an independent board member, one of the boards I served on, we had an Asian investor that wanted to do the round. And they, for personality reasons, did not want a woman on the board. And so the CEO came to me and said, they want to put money in, but they don't want a woman on the board. Are you willing to resign your position? Which of course I did because I thought it was the best thing for the company. But if they're independent, you can have those discussions.
Yeah.
And by the way, I did get some accelerated.
Exactly, that's what. You accelerated the options.
So when it was acquired, it was a very good outcome for me. Yeah.
Okay, let's give a round of applause to this terrific. So, thank you. I'm just gonna put in, Jeff mentioned my new book that just came out. A week from today, next Wednesday, we're having a gathering of people just like yourselves, a celebration of the publication of this book. Free to come, I'll send you all a quote invitation. So please, it's in Boston, in the Seaport District, 5 to 7 p.m. So I'm gonna send you an invitation, please come.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you. Great meeting you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely touch base with
Hello,
you.
man.
Yeah.
I know you said hello.
Yeah, absolutely. How's he doing?
Doing great.
Yeah.
Health is-
Oh, good. Excellent.